This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are discussing antagonistic forces. So when your story does not have a villain per se, an evil being, a black hat, a corporation, something we can just hang that label on of the bad guy, then, yes, cue Robert's evil laugh. Then what are you left with? What becomes the antagonist in your story? So I'm sure we can all think of some examples. The loss of a child or spouse. Kathryn, you mentioned cancer earlier when we were talking before the show. What other sort of antagonistic forces are there, or a specific example?
I think the obvious one is nature. You often man against nature is oft used. I mean, particularly with me in sci-fi as well. And you'll see that with sci-fi stories. I can think of two right off the top of my head. Matthew Mather's Nomad, which is about a spinning black hole that tears through the solar system, and what they have to do to survive on Earth. And Neil Stephenson wrote something similar with Seven Eves, which is where, again, an antagonist, I think that might also be black hole driven, where the moon breaks up and causes major climactic change on Earth that makes it uninhabitable. So, I think that there's that. We've seen that in movies, not any particularly good ones, but, Armageddon type things.
Sure, yeah, natural disasters.
Yeah. So, San Andreas. Okay, there's some really bad. That's the trouble, isn't it? When you do come into man against nature antagonistic forces, it's a shame that it gets misplayed sometimes. But they're my. So you went deep with the internal stuff, like cancer or the psychological. So I think internal genre-driven stories can easily have force that's not personified.
Yeah, let's kind of take a moment to break this down a bit, because you're guiding us into the question of genres. So if we've got like a natural disaster, that might be science fiction, or it might be a thriller type movie. We've got perhaps literary fiction, or more broadly contemporary fiction, where it could be man against himself, so to speak, with the internal psychological issues such as grief, or it might be addiction, something like that. So with romantic comedies, there's the will they, won't they get together. So it might be the antagonistic force might be the errors in the comedy of errors, misconceptions about each other, misunderstandings, good-intentioned or ill-intentioned friends who get in the way. It's just kind of all those mishaps on the way to the happily ever after. What other genre-specific antagonistic forces can you guys think of?
Society is a big one. So where the society is oppressive, Handmaid's Tale, for example, the Orwell's work, Aldous Huxley, those kind of literary. Some of them are literary, but they're not always.
Also science fiction or speculative fiction.
Yes, that's right. Where you can have alien cultures that become an oppressive force. So I'd say society. So we can go right internal. We can go to the non-personified, but it's because of the, as you say, person's internal struggle. But you can also go broad with its society struggle. Although my belief is that those are hard to write unless the main character has a very specific goal and a conflict that's baked into that, because otherwise it becomes just philosophical, and philosophical fiction is hard to read.
Yeah, right. And I think that sometimes with society ones too, that you do tend to have one person that represents the society that becomes the antagonistic person that your protagonist is dealing with constantly.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. When you have an antagonistic force instead of a villain, how do you create conflict for your protagonist? How do we get that force to appear embodied or active to, actually create plot points and conflict for our protagonist?
I would go to Robert McKee's idea of exposition as ammunition, because the difficulty, for writers is going to be they're going to want to tell that antagonistic force as opposed to show it. So I think this goes to Kathryn's point about often that force might be represented in a particular character or by a particular character or set of characters, but also then we need to have maybe some device that allows that force to be made more concrete. And the stupid way to do it is, Bob, as soon as that meteor gets closer to the Earth, it's going to cause some pretty enormous tsunamis. That's right, we'd better do something about that. But the idea of it is that at some point characters are going to face this, and they're going to need to have some way of exploring it. Which is tricky, because if that force isn't unconsciously acting on them, if you're writing one of those very deep psychological thrillers, then that takes a deft hand, I think.
Right, it does. And I think for one of my historical novels, it's set in Victorian Minnesota, so something of a frontier town.
Yep.
There is a villain, but beyond him, there is the culture and the ideas of what womanhood is, and the limitations of medicine, and the role of religion in society. So all of those are antagonistic forces that are at play. And so, whatever that villain is doing, all of the other people are also embodying that culture. It shapes who they are and how they interact. And so that is a way in which those forces create obstacles for my protagonist. She and her villain are not in a vacuum. So
no, that's right. So I think, and it goes back to what Kathryn said, is that the very essence of showing, not telling, is how does that antagonistic force play out? And I think Kathryn's big question is, if that's your main villain, quotes, then it is tricky if the main villain is something that's nebulous, intangible, conceptual. And it seems like, as we talk around it, the only way really we're going to make that a interesting story as opposed to a philosophical exploration of literature is going to be via the... I know we've talked about non-personification, but you're going to have to personify it. But they aren't the villain, they're just the representation of it. And I like what you said, Alida, in multiple parts there as well. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, and it can come in multiple people representing it too. Like the story that I'm thinking of, I think it's called Firefly Lane by Kristen Hanna. It's about two friends who've grown up together, and one of them ends up with terminal cancer, right? That conflict. Oh, totally. Yeah. And she totally dies at the end. Sorry, I ruined it. But the point is that the conflict, it does kind of, the cancer is sort of personified in the way that people are treating her, or in her own way of handling her relationships because of it. The way that she tries to manipulate her husband and her child and her best friend in order to make things the way that she wants because of this, elephant in the room. So even though there's not one person you could ascribe to being the antagonistic person, that force of cancer and everything that it means, and the darkness that brings into their relationships, it changes everything. All of a sudden everything means something different because of that force. So it can be personified through different people in different scenes and different ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying just brought to mind another possible distinction for us to explore, is that in something like the natural disaster story, the antagonistic force is this very external event that affects our characters, that they have to come into conflict with. They have to survive it, or they have to overcome it. Whereas these internal issues, whether physical, like a disease, like cancer, or emotional, like grief after loss, they are explorations of relationships and, our psychology and our emotional life, and how these forces, whether, somehow external, somehow internal, are affecting our lives in a very intimate way. So there's sort of the big dynamic force of nature versus the kind of the minutiae, the subtleties, the intricate forces of these internal antagonists.
Yeah, and if you can play both, then we're starting to get into something that's potentially very thrilling as well to read. I think when works of great fiction, when we see the external battling the internal, and challenge and conflicts represented through different characters and not just cardboard cutout characters. And, it's challenging.
Right. Yeah. And I think as writers, we need to be aware of doing both. So with, the natural disaster story, you give your protagonist, he's not just an action hero, he's an action hero with a young daughter in tow. So now there's that push-pull of the relationship and having to look out for someone else. So we have the big external and the intimate internal. And with the, cancer type of story, the driving force is that internal source of conflict, but then we see the external relationships changing. And so, it's a smaller scale than something like a tsunami, but you get that external force as well, even though our antagonist is just mutant cells, inside your own body.
Well, and something I think could be really interesting to explore in something like, say, a natural disaster piece is that you can have people that are coming up against your protagonist that are not antagonists. They're just simply people who have conflicting views. You know what I mean? So they can almost fill the role of a supporting character that's providing conflict, rather than having to have someone who's truly evil, or someone whose interpretation of things is a negative or bad interpretation. They can just simply have another way of trying to approach it that isn't the way that ultimately the protagonist needs to use, which is an interesting way of spinning it.
Well, I think I'd argue that that's essential, actually, in those types of stories, because otherwise it's just boring. And it's like, how do we stop this rock crashing into Earth? And I think that's been the problem with some of those big scale movies, is that they're focused on the CGI and the dramatic, and have used the personification as just personal stories of, I need to save my family. It's when there's real conflict. I mean, what did I watch recently? Apollo 13. I rewatched recently because I read the book. Actually, I picked up the book for $1 at the school book sale, and I just thought that'd be interesting. And it was fascinating. I really recommend it. It's a perfect example of narrative nonfiction fictionalized. It's like if you've ever read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. It's got that feel about it. It's a story unfolding, and even though you know what happens, you're wondering what happens, and that's true, wonderful writing. And it made me want to watch the movie again. And in the movie, it's amazing how much they leave out.
Right.
And the book really has some staggering issues that they had to overcome. It's just a miracle they even made it back home. It really is extraordinary. And when you look at the equipment they were dealing with compared to what we have now, so the antagonist was a malfunction, a complex malfunction that caused knock-on effects. So everyone's battling that, and they all want the same goal, but there are conflicting ideas. Plus, time is running out. So is a ticking clock in it. There's a lot of different moving parts in there. And when you watch the movie, it's intensely personal, because it's mostly these three guys cooped up in a cockpit.
Right.
So it's not all about the, it's about their own life and death questions, and for one of them, it's the sheer depression that he was never going to land on the moon. This was going to be his trip and his last chance at it, and it's not going to happen. So it was the personification of that antagonistic force, which is, will they live or will they die because of this accident, is really interesting.
Right. And that sounds like a really good example, the book, not the movie, of weaving those two things we're talking about together, the intimate, subtle, internal aspects of whatever this antagonistic force brings to bear on your character's life, and the sort of big conflict issue, in that case, the malfunction. In, our other example case here, cancer, the disease. But I just want to say the role of the supporting character is always to complicate the protagonist's journey.
Yes.
That is it.
Has to be
so they can be truly supportive, loving, encouraging people, but they still somehow need to complicate the protagonist's journey by being dependent, by having different viewpoints, by not wanting to talk about the issue, whatever that is. But that is
cat.
a great...
He's a very nice little boy, but he tries to trip me up every time I walk down the stairs.
Yeah.
It's very annoying.
Yes. Yeah,
so I have
intentionally.
To shout
right?
He's trying to kill me.
Yeah, but that was a great point to raise, Kathryn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what other questions do we have about antagonistic forces?
Well, how conceptual can they get? Does it make it too much of a sort of a theoretical piece of fiction? Does it make it hard work when we don't have it brought to fore? I mean, Kathryn's question was fantastic, which is, how do you deal with it if it's it's not in the form of a person? And their answer basically is, put it into the form of a person. But they're not the villain, but they're the representation of it, or and partial representation, or an aspect of.
Right, and it plays out through the people. Yeah, I think
is it possible to do it without that?
I think it is in short stories.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Because then you're looking at a much smaller unit of fiction, so you can go conceptual and leave people with a question to ponder. But in a novel and long-form fiction, we are character and plot driven. You can't have one without the other in a long-form story, or it becomes dull, frankly.
Or experimental, in which case, you're limiting your audience to people who are looking for experimental fiction. So I think it's important not to judge. I mean, I'm a big reader of genre fiction, and I like a well-formed story. So I do struggle to read experimental literary. But there are people there who, for them, it's what they like. So I guess if you've got a conceptual antagonist, then that might lend itself towards that style of writing. And as you say, in short story, perhaps if it's something that listeners want to experiment with, then that's probably a good place to start.
Or even a novella. But the question is, how theoretical can you be? And if you're in long form experimental or not, we need sources of conflict. So if it's man versus himself, then what conflict is the character creating to manifest externally, to explore? You could read Sartre or Camus and be very philosophical, very experimental, but you're still going to have some kind of action on the page. Like in The Stranger, the protagonist shoots a man on the beach who happens to be Arab, and that happens at the beginning of the book, and then the rest of it is quite philosophical. What are the repercussions of this? So sure, you can do it, but it's it still has an event that triggers all of these questions and different actions. And, it's been many, many years since I've read The Strangers.
Yeah, and those are the ones that are memorable, So you wonder how many more experimental or theoretical or conceptual works have never really, or we've never finished them,
Right.
or they never made it past an agent's desk because, they didn't have the capacity to hook a reader. So I think it's probably one of the more challenging works of fiction to write.
Well, and
doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, I think that it comes down to remembering what the whole point of the antagonist is. And,
Right.
Whether you're using a person or, a force of nature or a society or, the laws or the regulations that your character needs to follow, like the point needs to still be that they're the antagonist. In some way, they're bringing the conflict, they're opposing the protagonist's goal, whatever that is. So as long as you have something functioning to do that, then hopefully you have a story.
Right. And, we've been very focused on plot, but I think the other thing to look at is character arc and some kind of transition. So if you aren't going to have events and that sort of external conflict, exploring this question, this theoretical, leaning question, then we want to see some change in the character that is a result of this internal conflict. You have to leave the reader with something, however ambiguous it happens to be. So we walk away, if not wowed by the plot or crying from the relationships or exalted from the relationships, then we should walk away in wonder, contemplating this great theoretical antagonistic force you've presented us with.
You're doing very well with that very non-theoretical antagonistic force that wants to eat your headphones and your pen and destroy your glasses there, Kathryn.
She is quite the antagonistic force, yes.
She is. She's
very
just
interesting.
a perfect supporting character, complicating your
That's
journey
right.
here.
Yeah. She's
Yes.
sharing you with love in her own way.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.